Hi, my name is José Berardo Cunha and this video is part of a series about mobile development architecture. Now it's time to have a brief overview about hybrid apps. Let's review our diagram over mobile development tiers. We started covering the native apps tier, and you can see there are two specific sides, Android and iOS. And then we decide to go to the other side of the spectrum and discuss web apps. And we introduced a way to develop for the middle ground for something in between Android and iOS. Initially, we talked about some frameworks, web components, and then after, in the previous video, we introduced you to progressive web apps. If you haven't seen those videos, again, I recommend you to do so because I believe that makes more sense if you watch them in the right order. You can see now we are below the browser's layer, and it's important to highlight that hybrid apps are still a kind of web apps, so you can use for most of these frameworks. For example, Ionic is on top of Angular. You can use any one of the frameworks in the top that I put specific for web apps at this layer as well. In this layer, you can see some frameworks in the top, in the first line, but there is also a second line talking about Cordova/PhoneGap. And now this is not for coincidence. Actually, Cordova and PhoneGap are providing services for those frameworks. So they are built on top of Cordova/PhoneGap. So what exactly is Cordova? We discuss right now. But before, it's important to note that we are still not going straight to the operational system. There is someone else that makes all the communication with the operational system, which is a WebView for Android and WK WebView for iOS. That's the main reason that in the second video, when I present to you how to use Xcode and how to use Android, I decide to, instead of doing a normal or more common Hello World example for both, I decide to add exactly those components so you can understand exactly how hybrid apps work. And it's also important to mention that hybrid apps sometimes is a term that can be used by the general meaning of every type of cross-platform app. So I'd like to be strict here in this video because we have lots of names to memorize. So for me, I consider cross-platform app everything that can be written in a single code base and target both platforms. By the term hybrid apps, although you can see sometimes this being used with the same meaning, here hybrid apps is just this layer, this tier on top of a WebView. So what exactly is Cordova? Cordova is actually a very old project. It started pretty much right after the first release of Android and iOS came out. The main idea was give the web developer the ability to create apps that has communication with the native environment. So they are not something on top of the browsers. And then it was a long time ago, so there was no one talking about progressive web apps. So there was no other option for web developers to create their own content and then ship content into Android and iOS. So it's a very popular approach. Many big companies still use this approach because they prefer to follow the approach to have one single code base and target not only mobile apps for Android and iOS, but also web apps, so it can be run on desktop environments as well. Cordova was a project created by a company called Nativescript, and it was bought by Adobe. And when Adobe bought the company, they decided to make this product a commercial product with the name PhoneGap. That's why the name Cordova is also called PhoneGap. But after a little while, Adobe decided to open again the source code and give away the source code to the Apache Foundation. So Apache runs a Cordova project, and what Adobe does now is wrap this Cordova into one specific commercial version called PhoneGap. So today, PhoneGap is actually one implementation of Cordova based on the main Cordova project, but for specific reasons for Adobe. So now what I'm gonna do is creating a new Cordova project. I'm here on a terminal with Cordova already installed. So if you have a minimum understanding of how Node.js works, Cordova can be installed using npm command. So npm I or npm install and -g to be global, and then you can simply define Cordova. The name Cordova here is just the directory I created. We don't have to create, of course, this directory, but just for me to make sense what I'm discussing now. So once I have Cordova installed, I'll run the command Cordova create, and then I'll define my directory name. I'll just call this Cordova demo. And after, I can define a reverse order of my project domain. If you remember, this was used for both Android and iOS. So I'll define au.com.specializer.cordova demo. And then I can define a human readable project name. So this time we'll call this Cordova demo capitalized. So that's okay. This command create my project. So I can simply type cd for my directory, Cordova demo. And inside this directory, what I can see is a file structure. So I will use a text editor called Visual Studio Code. So I'll just type code dot to open this project in Visual Studio Code. Now that I have my project open in Visual Studio Code, I can see the same directory I was seeing before. And that's better for us to understand what's going on inside. The most important directory for the moment is this www. If you open this directory, you can see the index.html, which is the main entry page for your project. Another important directory here is the platforms directory. It's still empty because I haven't created any platforms yet. Let's use the integrated terminal from Visual Studio Code so we can type something and see what's the result at the same time. I'll just type this Ctrl backtick. Let's make this slightly bigger. And then type the command Cordova platform add Android. What this command will do is creating the whole structure for you to develop for Android. As you can see, a subfolder inside platforms was created called Android. And then inside you can see most of the files that you already have for the native development. If you remember, build.gradle, settings.gradle, and inside the app you have the build Gradle from your app, and inside the source directory you have the Android manifest. That's pretty much the same structure, totally based on the original native development. But actually you shouldn't use this platform because it's meant to be auto-generated. So I don't recommend you to go inside this platform directory and change those files. You must use the Cordova way to change your stuff. So one very important file here is config.xml. In this config.xml, you can define many of the instructions that you would define inside the Android or iOS version. I've run the command to create the Android platform. I can also create Cordova platform add iOS. And this will, of course, create the second platform, which is iOS. Let me just close this Android here. Once this command is executing, you will see the second directory. So yeah, let's run our app. I have my Android emulator on the right side just to run this command, Cordova run Android. Of course, if I replace Android with iOS, this will call the iOS simulator and run the same project. My build was successful. This yellow line here is just saying that I didn't define any specific device and it was not able to find any attached device, which means that it tried to run my emulator. And then you can see the project is running. That's the initial page. And if you open this index.html, you see hello world and then device is ready. If I change anything, just change the message here and run this command again. Of course, there are some tools that we can hot reload this. Right now you can see I changed this message inside. So I changed my HTML content. One thing that I'd like to show is actually coming back to Android Studio. So let's come back to the project we created on Android Studio to run our first demo. I'll run this again. And after the project is loaded, just go to the main menu and the tools and select Layout Inspector. This will show a screen that you can select the process that is running and then click OK. Now you can see in my project there is a web view inside my main activity. Let's do exactly the same for the Cordova app. Let me just come back to the Cordova app. I'll open this again. That's here running. If I do the same, go in Tools, Layout Inspector, but instead of running only the process created by the Android Studio, if I click to show all process, I can see the other process running for my second app, which is the Cordova demo, and I click here and then OK. This will capture the hierarchy for the Cordova demo and show that to me. And now you can see in the view tree, there is a frame layout and inside there is a system web view. It's another implementation of web view, but anyway, it's a web view. And then you can see you have no access to those components inside because what you see from the Android perspective is just one single component. Inside that is render your HTML code. So this is not a text view, this is not an image, it's actually one single component rendering everything. Now that we've seen a brief introduction to Cordova, let's go ahead and present some of the frameworks working on top of Cordova. The first one, and probably the most popular one, is Ionic. Ionic is going to its fourth major version, which is, as I said before, on top of Stencil web components. If you want to create a Cordova app, I highly recommend you to use Ionic. Instead of just going straight to Cordova, only using Cordova, I recommend you to use Ionic because it brings a lot more stuff on top of your JavaScript. So for Cordova, you pretty much just have vanilla JavaScript. There is no component out of the box. So Ionic has a lot of components and they are pushing their components to become in accordance to web component standard. So yeah, Ionic is a very good choice if you want to develop a hybrid app. Another one is Framework 7. It brings a lot of iOS specific components as well as material design for Android. And one of the differences from Ionic is Framework 7 is not based on Angular, which is the case for Ionic. Another framework is Quasar. And differently from both, Quasar is highly tied to Vue.js. So if you have plans or if you're already developing in Vue, that's a very good option for hybrid apps. Another one is OnceUI. This OnceUI, as you can see, you can use one of the most famous frameworks. Let's also discuss the pros and cons for this tier. The main pro is essentially web apps shippable to official app stores. That's the main idea for Cordova, that's the main idea for this tier for hybrid apps. You can reuse your skills for web development and then ship those skills into a mobile app, so you can deliver your app from the app stores. This can be used along with any JavaScript framework or library. As I showed before, most of the frameworks focus on this hybrid development. They are also on top of the most famous frameworks in the market at the moment. Code is still highly shareable across platforms because you actually not writing your code to the platform. You are writing your code to the web view, which is a browser layout engine. You don't have the browser visual stuff, but you still have its layout engine. You can access native features, for example, camera, accelerometer, pretty much all of the native features. One of the most important parts of Cordova is its plugins ecosystem. But what about the cons? The most important con is still performance issues. You probably noticed that the hybrid apps is just a little bit underneath progressive web apps, which means that you still have to rely on a browser in order to actually render that content. That brings the same performance bottlenecks that you might find on a progressive web app. Because a hybrid app have to mimic all native UI components on top of a single web view. All of the rest of web components must be created by your framework or by you if you want to have a richer set of components. It's also interesting to notice that it's harder to be accepted and published on App Store. From experience, I can tell you it's a little bit harder to get your app approved by Apple if it's not a native app. It usually takes longer to have native features available for those environments. That's because most of hybrid developers, normally they wait for someone to provide a plugin so they can use this plugin from the JavaScript perspective, instead of implementing the plugin or running a code that can communicate with some new features from the native platform. To sum up, we discussed initially how the native architecture is. Let's show now how the hybrid architecture is. You have your JavaScript code, necessarily JavaScript, and then you communicate with a web view, which is a browser engine, and also you have a bridge, which is normally Cordova, to communicate with some services. In the next video, we'll go even further down the line to discuss other approaches so you can have a better understanding how they work, and then you can make your decision what will be the one that you pick up for your next project. So see you in the next video.